to try and have a discussion on two people whose personas and their afterlife are so multi-layered now that it is impossible for any one of us to say that we are completely in control of, either Gandhi or Bose, or that any one person can say that I have the definitive view on both. I think for me, the first point would clearly be, and I think that is, to a large extent, frames the discussion for me, is the fact that we must not forget. I mean, in this fight, or in this, I don't want to use the word fight, in positing the two of them in terms of men of ideas, we must not forget that Bose is 28 years younger than Gandhi. Bose died when he was 48. So it's a different generational perspective, and I think that is an important thing for me when I look at how much he achieved in that time. Going back to what for me is, in my reading of Bose, and I will agree with what Lakshmi Das ji said, as you grow, ideas will change, but at my current understanding, I think I would say that Bose is clearly a product of his context. And that context has 2 or 3 dimensions to it. And being rooted in Bengal is a very important part of that context. You are in a part of the country which is a very active part of the country. There are various currents that are important, and I'll just come to them in a minute. Number 2, he also comes from this family that is a great thrust on education. Yes, there was elitism, there was a very strong Western influence, but here is a family in which a boy at age 12 also had the freedom, because the family provided him that freedom, to decide that. So all Bose boys went to English-speaking schools in Cuttack. Their father wanted them to speak perfect English, and so only in middle school did they go to a school which taught Bengali or Sanskrit. So their English was better than their Indian language skill. But by the time he's 12, he comes in touch with a teacher who makes him conscious. I mean, he gets conscious of both things. One, that he needs to learn his own mother tongue. And from being not at the top of the Bengali class, I think he gets there by the end of the semester. And he takes pride in that. And he also makes a switch to Indian clothes, which is an important thing. At age 12, there are young people in this room. There is safety in doing what your peers do. There is safety in that kind of context to go with what is the dominant view. There was the Raj, that was the elite Indians were westernized. But here is somebody who has a reflexivity, who is willing to think for himself and start to wonder what it is that, how he defines his world and his worldview. And I think that independent streak is something that stays with him throughout his life, that he wants to think for himself. He wants to go against the grain of whatever the others may be doing. And in that sense, there's also a similarity. I mean, the other one that we could do is Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru, because in that context, there's only an 8-year age gap. Both of them are people who kind of lead their parents or their families into the national movement. So it is Bose who decides to go against. You come from a family of barristers, of lawyers, people seeking employment with the British government, and careers which are lucrative. And he's very bright. He's a great exam taker. He tops every exam he takes. But he goes to England. His father sends him to England, and he decides he cannot do the ICS exam. So even though he clears part 1, he decides against doing part 2. And then he spends all his time in, but he wanted the experience of the English education. So he spends all his time reading philosophy, which was his major subject, and reading about everything else. So I think the context of a home that gave him that freedom, that gave him the facility to think for himself, is important. And then when he comes back, I think Gautam talked about the fact that by 1921, when he comes back, he's made up his mind. He's not going to have a career. He's going to devote his life to nationalism or attainment of freedom. And the first thing he does when he gets off the boat is go and talk to Gandhi. And then Gandhi pushes him in the direction of C.R. Das, who becomes for him the father figure. Also, when he was 14, he left home in search of a guru. So he actually went against parental authority. He disappeared for a few months. He wanted to go and look for somebody who could be his guide. And then there was like he liked his parents, but he wanted other figures. And C.R. Das then became his guru. And in many ways, the Das view of Bengal and Bengal politics then became his defining worldview. So there's the home, then there is the rootedness in Bengal, then there is, of course, the context of what he gains by going to the West, and then the context of what the All India Congress Committee is doing. So these are three different contexts, but at any point, like all of us, we carry multiple identities. You could not take the Bengal congressman out of Bose when he is with the Congress Committee at an All India level. And I think those concerns of Bengal, the fact that the BPCC was an extremely fraught organization, the fact that there was a lot of infighting, the fact that he wanted the Congress central leadership to side with him. There's this parallel story going on in his life about the fight in the Bengal Congress and then what we are trying to do with the big Congress movement. And I think one of the other things that he completely, for him, just as non-violence was not negotiable for Gandhi, for Bose what is not negotiable is the attainment of freedom. For him, everything else was secondary. So if you came and said there's a caste thing happening somewhere, he would pay attention, but it was not just important. It was, he said, either reduce everybody in India to Brahmins or Shudras. Can we just do away with caste? Make everybody the same caste. But these issues are not important. Nothing is more important than gaining independence. So it was a non-negotiable truth for him. Labor trouble, labor unions are fighting. As an urban Bengali, he did not have that exposure to rural farming peasantry. Following C.R. Das, he spent a lot of time doing labor unions, the Tata Labor Union, others, they went in, they tried to solve labor crises. They tried to encourage peasants, workers, laborers to form institutions. And then he was left trying to control the infighting within institutions, which again seemed to exasperate him, because then his point was clearly all of this is secondary to first attaining nationalism. And I think in that he and Gandhi were, as Lakshmidas ji also said, they were essentially the same kind of worldview. But it is a context, it depends on the context from which you are coming. That will define how you set out what you are setting out. So that's something that is important. I mean, as far as I see him. Okay. Again, I think common to another very important. I mean, in the reading from I'm trying to find the name. Vagisha read the Haripura Congress address as being the president of the Congress. That's a very famous address. It's also his longest ever public address to a national audience. It's the first time he's setting out. He has arrived on the national stage. In 1938, he's only 41 years old. He's the second youngest man, I think, to ever be Congress president. Maulana Azad made it at 35. So you're a young president of a national party, and you are addressing a national audience, and so that Haripura address is important. But he has an idea there, for which I don't think he got that much credit later on, namely the setting up of the Planning Commission. The fact that this country needs to have centralized, a notion of planning. We need that big picture. And the fact that he's thinking about a common lingua franca. We know that the INA finally did adopt Hindustani with Roman script as their. So he put it into practice when he got the chance to do that. But these were important ideas. And the other idea that I think was way ahead of its time in Bengal, which again C.R. Das came up with and which Bose put into practice, was what was called the Bengal Pact, which was that while you may fight about electoral, separate electorates or electorates based on how much population a community had, we should not forget Bengal had 51% Muslims, but they did not get 51% of the electoral seats. They had more like 20% of the seats. So C.R. Das actually had come up with something called the Bengal Pact, which was that as the Swarajist party, which was, you can use the word extremism, wing within the Congress, that if we are in a council legislature, any job that comes up, we will give majority jobs to the Muslims. Because he felt that India cannot be free and the Congress cannot be an organization that is only an organization of elite, one particular kind of class of English-speaking people. And I think Bose bought into that a lot, that you needed the India we were constructing, or the India that he was trying to fight for freedom, was everybody's India from the ground up. And clearly that included every caste and every community. And so when he became CEO of the Calcutta Corporation, which is also what he became very soon after 1921 when he came back, he gave 25 out of 33 appointments in the Calcutta Corporation to Muslims. And he got a lot of flack for it in the press. And Gandhi actually wrote to say that I've seen the press and I've seen the statement of the CEO of the Calcutta Corporation, and I think he's done something very good. And if India has to be free, I had the quote somewhere, Hindus will have to give in to other communities and learn to share. So I think these were ideas way beyond his time. I also think, like many other people, and I think Lakshmi Dasi touched on it, the sacrifice that he made also, in a personal sense, in an actual physical sense, is a young man who is completely broken because he's inclusive. He's inclusive with people, he's also inclusive with ideas. And that included what was in Bengal. This was the Bengal of Aurobindo Ghosh. After all, C.R. Das was the lawyer for Aurobindo Ghosh. So the ideas of Vivekananda, of Aurobindo Ghosh, and other young people, who the two parts of India that seemed to have sprouted those youth at that point was Punjab and then Bengal. He was willing to listen to a word that the British intelligence agencies used, so-called terrorists or revolutionaries. But this was his view, his notion of being inclusive. And because he was supposed to be, or he was labeled pro-them, apart from Tilak, he becomes the person, he's arrested as the CEO of the corporation in the middle of the night from his house. The first time he's arrested, and there's no charge. No charge sheet is ever filed. But it is declared that it's too dangerous to hold him first, even in Bengal. Then it's too dangerous to have him even in India. And so we have to send him abroad. The first time when he goes to Mandalay, it completely breaks his health. And I think a large part of his life after that is spent with periods of ill health, which is undiagnosable. Even Dr. B.C. Roy and all of these people cannot diagnose what's wrong with him. So here's a man who's forced to spend a large part of his life outside India. And he makes the best of it because he then uses that time to acquaint himself with a lot of other philosophies and a lot of other political currents of what are happening. And yes, I think you used that word too. He was not shy to use the word, and he used it. He used both the word fascism and socialism. This is, a lot of the writing and the talking it's dynamic, so it can be a work in context. He may sound like he's contradicting himself sometimes. But I think he was very clear that even with Soviet socialism, he said the Soviets did not follow verbatim what Marx said. They had their own version of it. So he wanted India to come up with an Indian version. So this is a thinking politician who is clearly articulating what it is that he wants and trying to put that down. I'm now trying to find a quick note on which I can wrap this up. So he's and he's leaving himself open to criticism at that point. But he's not scared to bring in these words and words that have been used against him in latter day discourse or discussion. But I think so. This is, from my point of view, the key theme would be both in context and the fact that we need to read him in that context. He is a product of his context, but it's not like he's he's just doing that unconsciously. He's a conscious product of his context and where he takes that. So I'll end with this. Sorry.
The splendid, grand and massive neo-Buddhist copper dome of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. It gets its influence from stupa at Sanchi. The dome is more than twice the height of the rest of the building. The reinforced concrete shell of the outer dome began to be formed during the beginning of 1929. The last stone of the dome was laid on April 6, 1929.
So I think when you're looking at Bose and you're looking at Gandhi, I think you have to look at the kind of lives that they chose to live. A lot of details have been just shared by the speaker before me about the choices that were made by Subhash Chandra Bose. And we are sitting in a space where we know a lot about the choices that Gandhi also made, which are about, to begin with, the idea of what Lakshmi Das ji said, tyag, sacrifice. So the whole notion of trajectories of nationalism, I think the fundamental base for that is sacrifice or tyag. Now, we may say, and when you are talking about tyag or sacrifice, you cannot say, uska tyag bada tha, uska tyag chota tha. And I think we have to walk away from those categories of hierarchy. A sacrifice is a sacrifice is a sacrifice. You may choose to sacrifice in one way, another person may choose to sacrifice in another way. And the fact is that both these sacrifices were not made for individual success or greatness. Both these sacrifices were made with an idea which is still not sure is really found root in our country, which is the notion of public good. So there is a notion of public good where it is very, very important that some of us, many of us, and hopefully all of us someday should believe that individual good cannot be separated from public good. And I think it is, when you look at the lives of Bose and Gandhi, you begin to recognize that here are two men, expensively educated, internationally educated. They get educated in places that people are still trying to go and get education. And I think in both the case of Gandhi and Bose, they discovered the independent life when they were not at home. When they were both in England, both their encounters with Britain shaped them. It shaped them because it was not very easy, even though Bose was more Eurocentric, more European, more Anglicized. Father was very, very European and Anglicized. Still, it was difficult to live. And by the way, by the time Bose goes to England, the whole notion of going to England has changed. When Gandhi goes to England, you lose caste, you're crossing the black waters, purification rites have to take place. But by the time Bose goes to England, going to England for Indians of a certain kind is okay. There are some 700 odd Indians already in the university that he's going to. So the situation is very different. But even if it is different, the challenges are not very different. In fact, if anything else, England's view of India has become even more harsh. So while there may be more Indian students in England, the view of England is harsher because Indians have started saying, we need freedom, Swaraj, dijiye aap, leke rahenge hum, hamara hak hai. So it's a very, for me it's very interesting because it's a movement from a dependent life to an independent life, and then finally with both of their returns to India. When you look at both of them, what you get is a contributive life based on the idea of public good. They disagreed, and they disagreed publicly, and it has been documented, but the very fact that their disagreements are documented is important because they weren't pretending to be best friends and cutting each other from behind. So they disagreed not because they disliked each other. They disagreed because even though their goalpost was similar, which as was mentioned before me, was freedom was what they both wanted. It's just that there are many roads to freedom, and they walked slightly different roads sometimes. So Gandhi actually writes to him at that point of time in the year 1940, and I'll read it out from here. He says, "You are irrepressible whether ill or well. Do get well." So whatever you are irrepressible, but I still want you to get well. And he says, do get well before going in for fireworks. It's just like a father talking to his son. This is how parents speak to their children. Yes, I know you want to say much, but pehle tabiyat to theek kar lo. I am surprised you want to distinguish between discipline and indiscipline. This was a fundamental point of disagreement between them. And then Gandhiji says, very, very wonderfully, I think, till one of us is converted to the other's view, we must sail in different boats. And I think this is important. Till one of us, so we are willing to go in two different boats, till one of us is converted. So what Gandhi says is there is a possibility of conversion of me to your ideas, maybe of you to my ideas. And I think that open space in which it is possible for people to accept, take on somebody else's view is very, very important. And then finally in this letter, which is the only, I'm just going to quote two Gandhi extracts. This first one in 1940, which is actually that he publishes in the Harijan. He says, finally he ends this letter by saying, "Meanwhile, let us love one another, remaining members of the same family that we are." And I think this is wonderful, that it ends on the notion of We are one kutumb. We are one family. We are dispossessed Indians looking for freedom. And we must love each other no matter whether we disagree or not. Now the second quotation I'd like to read out to you is after the court-martial of the 3 soldiers at Red Fort, which was the big INA story when a Muslim, a Sikh, and if I'm not wrong, a Punjabi Hindu were put on trial. And they were members of the erstwhile INA. By now, Subhash Chandra Bose is no longer alive. The trial takes place after that. But Gandhi recognizes the spirit of Bose's contribution by saying this about the revolutionary. He says the whole country has been roused, and even the regular forces have been stirred into new political consciousness and have begun to think in terms of independence. So this recognition of the fact that independence comes to us through this event, this trial of the 3 INA men, which was meant to break the back of Indian resistance and Indian militant military resistance, Gandhi endorses it. So I think he's already moved from another boat into the boat that Subhash Chandra Bose was sailing, though he was no longer present. And I think there are so many other things I can say. I'll just mention a couple of them. One is when Subhash Chandra Bose in Singapore raises the INA and the ranks of the soldiers are standing there. He's wearing what we would maybe call today a safari suit, but on his head, as in these images that you're seeing, is a Gandhi cap. So even as he does something that Gandhi may not have agreed or endorsed, he's still wearing the cap of Gandhi as he's wearing something else. And I think that symbolism is not accidental. And the fact that it is then that he calls him the father of the nation. So even as he walks away, he recognizes that freedom cannot be won by one person. Freedom, even if we disagree, growth, development, glory cannot be done with a single trajectory. We all have to unite, like the tributaries going into the ocean finally and becoming one. So finally, another last word, because I think this is not spoken about that much in the context of Subhash Chandra Bose, though it is spoken about more in the context of Gandhi. And since there are so many young girls here and some young women here, I'd like to say, and I'm a woman myself talking on 2 men, I think it is important for me to state that what united both of them is that they had high regard and great respect for the capacity of women. It was Gandhi who encouraged women to come out and take part in direct action for political freedom. It was Subhash Chandra Bose who created the Rani Jhansi regiment, and Colonel Sehgal's wife, Lakshmi Sehgal, is the head of that regiment. And till today now, if you go to Singapore and you go to their National Museum, one whole corner of the Singapore National Museum has a section on Subhash Chandra Bose, and more importantly, it has a section in that section on the Rani Jhansi regiment. And it is recordings from the 3 women who were still living, talking about what it was like to be influenced by Subhash Chandra Bose, to join up. They were young girls. They came from families like you and I. They decided, we will follow this man. He will give us freedom. And both men, I think, together conspired, aspired to give us freedom. So thank you very much. I'll close here.